She didn't knock. A 9-year-old girl stood on the other side of his screen door, snow in her hair and nothing on her feet but a pair of torn stockings soaked through with mud. She didn't say a word until Thomas Hale opened it. Then she looked up at him with eyes older than her years and said, "I can work." That was how she came to be standing in his kitchen on a winter morning in the high country of 1887, while snow came down so heavy it turned the world into a single soft white room. Thomas was 62 years old. He had buried his Mary in the spring of '84, and his boy Eli the winter after that, when the fever came down from the mining camps and took every child on the ridge. He had not spoken aloud to another person in his own house in almost 2 years. The chair across from him at the table was Mary's chair. He didn't sit in it. He didn't let anyone else. "Sit down," he told the girl, surprising himself. "I'll put coffee on. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We love knowing who's with us." Her name was Lily. She said so only after she'd eaten 2 biscuits and drunk half a cup of coffee with both hands around the mug to warm them. Her voice was small and careful, the way a voice gets when it has been told too many times to be quiet. She said she had been walking for 3 days. She said there was no family. She didn't say what had happened to the family, and Thomas didn't ask. He understood certain silences. He had lived inside his own. She slept that night on the cot in the back room, the one that had been Eli's, and Thomas sat up in his chair and watched the fire die down and listened to her breathe and felt something strange move through him. It was not happiness. He had forgotten what that felt like. It was the bare beginning of a thought that maybe a house with someone in it was not the same thing as a house that had someone in it once. He didn't take her in. That was what he would have told anyone who asked. He had simply not turned her out. There was a difference. He told himself it didn't mean anything. He told himself for 11 days. On the 12th day, she was waiting in the barn before he came out to feed. She had already spread the hay. She had counted the chickens without being asked. She had fetched the water. When he came out and saw what she had done, he stood in the doorway a long moment, and his throat worked, and no sound came out. Then he picked up the pitchfork, and they worked side by side in silence. It was Ezra Cobb who came by and said what needed to be said. Ezra was his nearest neighbor, 2 miles down the ridge, and he had been Mary's friend before she died. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and studied the girl through the kitchen window and said, "Tom, you can't take on a child. You can barely take on yourself." "I didn't take her on," Thomas said. "Then what do you call it?" "I call it not turning her out." Ezra shook his head. "That woman would have wanted you happy, Tom. That woman," Thomas said quietly, "would have known it wasn't any of her business anymore." Ezra left without saying another word. Thomas stood on the porch and watched the girl through the kitchen window as she carefully set the table, 2 plates this time, 2 mugs. He thought, if a child sets 2 places at the table, then she plans on being there in the morning. He wondered when he had started wanting her to be there in the morning. He didn't have long to wonder. 3 weeks after Lily arrived, a man on a fine gray horse rode up the lane and tied his horse to Thomas's hitching post without asking. He wore a broadcloth coat that cost more than Thomas's best mare. He did not introduce himself. He handed Thomas a folded paper and said, "Drummond sent me. You'll want to read it." Drummond. Cal Drummond. The cattle baron whose spreads ran from the river to the foothills and whose name signed half the notes at the bank in town. Thomas opened the paper. It was a survey notice. Drummond's new fencing line would pass directly through Thomas's north pasture, where his water came in. It said, in the formal language men use when they mean to rob you, that the rights had been granted by the county. It said Thomas had 30 days to vacate the disputed portion or the matter would proceed by law. The writer tipped his hat and rode away. Thomas stood in the yard and looked at the paper, and the paper looked back at him, the way paper does when it carries the weight of a man's whole life in it. Lily came out of the barn. She looked at the paper in his hand. She didn't ask what it was. She said, "What's his name?" "Drummond. The one with the big yellow house on the river road?" Thomas looked at her. "Yes. He came through here in October," she said quietly. "I saw him. I was in town. The men with him laughed when he walked past the church. And that was how the storm began. Would you have told her, in his place? Would you have let her see what was coming, or would you have tried to keep it from her a little longer?" The next 4 weeks were the longest of Thomas's life. Drummond was patient in the way that powerful men are patient. He did not need to threaten. His riders drifted through the valley on errands that took them past Thomas's fence line. They measured nothing. They only watched. They tipped their hats to Lily when she went to fetch the mail, and she did not tip hers back. On a Thursday in early March, two of the riders came to the gate and demanded Thomas sign the survey. He refused. They did not leave. The taller one swung his crop and caught Thomas across the shoulder, and Thomas did not go down, but when he swung back he was slower than he had been 20 years ago, and one of them caught him under the ribs, and another blow split his lip, and a third knocked him sideways, and he hit the post of his own gate with the back of his head, and went down on one knee in the snow. The riders laughed. They said they would be back in 3 days for his signature. They rode away. Thomas dragged himself into the barn. He could not make it to the house. Lily was already there. She had seen the riders from the kitchen window. She had her hands pressed flat to the counter and her face white. She didn't run to him. She went to the cupboard and got the whiskey and the clean linen and brought it out to the barn without a word and knelt beside him in the hay and tore the linen into strips and bound his ribs as neatly as any field surgeon. "He'll come back," Thomas said. "Yes," she said. "Then we'll go," Thomas said. "I'll sell the rest. We'll go somewhere he isn't." "No," she said. And that was the night Lily told him what she had been holding since October. She told him about the surveyor who had come through the back country in the fall, the one who had stopped at the creek that ran through Thomas's north pasture, the one she had watched from a ridge while she was hiding from men who had been chasing her since her mother died. The surveyor had paced off the land. He had set a stone at the high point of the pasture. He had written numbers in a leather book. Lily had read those numbers over his shoulder. She could read. She could remember. She had a mind that held what it saw. "The stone is still there," she said. "I'd stake my life on it. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She looked at him then with that older-than-her-years look. "Because you'd have sent me away," she said. "You wouldn't have let me stay if you thought I was useful. You would have kept me only if you wanted me." And Thomas felt his chest go tight, because she was right. He had not kept her because she was useful. He had kept her because the kitchen had been quieter with her in it, and because the chair across from him at the table was no longer the chair Mary died in. Lily had not displaced his wife. Lily had made the kitchen itself live again. He understood then, in a single clear blow of understanding, that she knew this, that she had known it for weeks, that she had lived in the terror of being useful instead of being wanted, because that was what every child who had been abandoned understood before she understood anything else. Drummond's forgery was the old stone set into the new survey. Drummond had paid the county man to substitute his own man's mark for the original. But the original was still there, with Lily's reading of the leather book held inside her like a sworn witness he could never buy or silence. It was 2 nights before Drummond's riders were due back. Thomas was lying in his bed with his ribs bound and his lips stitched with thread Lily had boiled. She was sitting on the floor beside his chair with the lamp between them. He said to her, "Why did you stay, Lily? The night you came. Why didn't you keep walking?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very small, "I only stayed because your farm looked lonely too." And Thomas, a man who had not wept in 3 years, a man who had carried the weight of his loss like a freight he had no right to set down, broke. The sound was not loud. It was the smallest sound. It was the sound of a man letting a thing he had been gripping too tightly come loose at last. He put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and Lily climbed up onto the chair across from him, Mary's chair, and laid her thin arms around his neck and held him the way he had once held his own son in the middle of the night when the coughing wouldn't stop. They stayed like that for a long time. The lamp burned low. She did not say she was sorry. He did not say he was glad. What they said, eventually, was only this, that they would not leave. That tomorrow he would ride to the county seat with the testimony she could recite, that she would come with him, that she would speak what she had seen because the law would listen to a child who had no stake in the matter, that when it was done, they would come home. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. They left at first light. They did not wait for Drummond's riders. Thomas rode the old bay mare, and Lily sat in front of him, both her arms around his middle. The snow had stopped. The morning was that still, ringing kind of cold that turns every breath into a small cloud of silver. Halfway down the ridge, she said, "Are you afraid?" "Yes," he said. "So am I," she said. "But I'd rather be afraid with you." The judge at the county seat was a man named Harlan Beck who had ridden for Thomas's father 40 years ago on a cattle drive out of Texas. He was old, and he was fair, and he remembered Mary. He sat them both down in his parlor, and he listened while Lily recited the numbers from the leather book and described the original stone and named the date she had seen the surveyor at the creek. He wrote it all down himself, in his own hand. He sent a man on horseback for the stone. It took 3 days for the stone to come in. The county surveyor himself came down from his office. He scraped the moss off the rock. He read the old marks. He sent word to the territorial land office. Within a week, Drummond's whole chain of title was unraveling in front of him. The forged survey was a forgery. The county clerk had taken money. Drummond knew it the same morning Thomas did, and he sent riders fast across the valley to try to buy the silence of every witness. But Lily was the one witness who could not be bought. She had no price on her. She was a child. She only knew what she had seen. Drummond came to his ruin slowly, the way powerful men do. The bank called his notes. His cattle were auctioned for unpaid tax. His riders were arrested one by one as they tried to cross into the next territory. His fine gray house on the river road sat empty, then mortgaged, then sold at sheriff's sale to a homesteader who had nothing to do with the Drummond name. The last Thomas heard of Cal Drummond in any detail was a letter from a town in the south, 2 years later, telling of a man who had washed up dead of his own hand behind a boarding house. There was no money left. There was no name worth speaking. There was only the cold, slow fact that a powerful man who had tried to grind a grieving rancher off his land had ended with nothing at all, and that the people he had tried to crush were still standing in the very house where it had happened. Thomas and Lily came home on a Tuesday evening in late spring. The snow had gone. The pasture was ankle-deep in new grass. The water ran clear in the creek where the old survey stone still stood. He set her down from the mare, and she ran straight for the kitchen and started the fire without taking off her coat. In the weeks that followed, things changed at the ridge in ways Thomas had not expected. Ezra Cobb came by and apologized without being asked and brought a sack of seed potatoes as a sort of tongue-tied gift. The Widmer family down by the river sent over 2 laying hens. The schoolteacher at the crossroads began to teach Lily her letters twice a week in the kitchen because they had no schoolhouse close enough. People began, without any arrangement being spoken, to come to the Hale place. They came for Mary's recipes. They came because Lily had begun to help in the vegetable garden. They came because, somehow, the kitchen in that house had begun to smell like bread again in the evenings, and people will always come where bread is being baked. Lily was not Thomas's daughter. She would never bear his name. She did not need to. When he signed the deed to the north pasture, he put her name on it beside his. He did it in front of the county clerk at the same desk where he had once watched Drummond's clerks try to erase his own name from the map. The clerk looked at him. Thomas said, "That's right. Both of them." If someone had told him, on the night the girl first appeared at his door with snow in her hair and nothing on her feet, that she would be standing beside him at that desk 3 years later, he would not have believed it. But there she was, and there he was. And the cabin that had looked lonely to a child from outside was no longer lonely at all. In the evenings, when the light goes long and golden over the ridge, you can sometimes see them on the porch. He sits in his chair. She sits on the step with her cheek against his knee, reading aloud from a book the schoolteacher has lent her. The kettle sings on the stove inside. The mare shifts in the pasture. Somewhere a screen door closes softly. And the farm, after all the years it spent waiting for someone to come home to it, finally remembers what it was like to have people in it who were not leaving. Next, we'll tell the story of a woman who walked into a gold rush town wearing a wedding dress that wasn't hers, and the old miner who recognized it as his dead wife's.